Hey guys, chapter 11 talks about assault, battery, and other crimes against a person. There's not a whole lot that I need you to take away from this chapter, so I'm going to go over the important highlights, the things that I want you to be aware of. But we will not go through all of these slides because some of this information is just for other classes that we cover, and maybe it's just a little bit too much detail. So let's go through and start by looking at the definition of assault. So assault and battery are often used at the same time. However, they're two very different things. Um, I explain it like this most often. Assault is saying I'm going to hit you. Battery is actually hitting you. Assault is an attempted battery, and the battery is the actual physical confrontation. In the state of Missouri, we don't even have a battery charge. We just have various degrees of assault. So you might have an attempted assault, or you might have assault in the first degree, which is, obviously the most significant or serious assault charge that you can have. As with other charges, whenever we add the word aggravated into it, it just means that it's been escalated or it's been taken to another level. So for an aggravated assault, this is things that we're talking about, like a firearm or a weapon that's been used. What's defined as a weapon has to be interpreted by the court, whether it's the jury or the judge. There's been a case where like a handkerchief was used as a weapon, but you may have heard like a person's hands, if they're a boxer or they're a trainer or something like that. But it's even more simple than that. If hands can be considered a weapon, especially if it was, a domestic violence incident where you have a large male who has beat up a female, the book will give you an example of a husband who choked his wife so hard that she felt her eyes bulge out of her head, and then he threw her into a bathtub, and he clearly was bigger and had a height and size advantage over her. So for that, the court did rule that his hands were a weapon just because of the nature of their body build and how he was so much bigger than she was. Hate crimes are an element that are added to many crimes against a person, such as an assault or battery, or a murder. But for this lesson, assault and battery, this just increases the penalty. So when states have enacted hate crime statutes, what this means is that the victim was selected because of their race, religion, sexual orientation, etc. And that status was a substantial factor in the decision to commit a crime. What this means, for in the last chapter, or actually I believe it was criminology, but many of you were in both classes. We talked, or I had you, I referenced Dylan Roof, who walked into a predominantly black church in South Carolina and killed people because he was so upset with black on white crime. And so it was really a terrorist act, but it was also hate crime because he selected those victims just because they were African American. So kidnapping. For the next couple slides, it's just some definitions and kind of explaining the difference. So kidnapping. Kidnapping is false imprisonment of a person, so taking away their liberty. They're not free to move. But for it to be kidnapping, that victim has to be moved from one place to another. So I'm taking you, I'm imprisoning you, and then I'm going to transport you from one location to the next. And that's important because if that movement does not happen, if you are not transported from one location to the next, it is not kidnapping. So kidnapping, taking somebody, holding them against their will, and then moving them from one location to the next. That's really important to understand because we're going to talk about hostage taking, and we're going to talk about I'm flying through the slides here. Hostage taking, and the difference between that and false imprisonment. So false imprisonment is the unlawful restraint of another person, and it's committed when they are detained. So for that to happen, the defendant must be confined or restrained, and their liberty or their freedom to move is taken away from them. It has to be intentional, and it has to be without the consent of the victim. And the defendant had no lawful authority to confine or restrain the movement of the victim. So this is not, a police officer who's imprisoning somebody or stopping them for such, for under the duty of the law. But false imprisonment is just essentially you're holding someone against their will. It's a lesser offense than kidnapping. And while we're talking about that, let's make sure that we hit on hostage taking, because hostage taking is the use of threat or force to restrain or confine a person with the intent to use that person as a hostage to compel another person to perform some act. So, hostage taking is more so like when you see a bank robbery and you're holding people in the bank so that you can make a getaway. But essentially, those you're not transporting anybody; you're just holding them a hostage for some sort of gain for that perpetrator, for that defendant. Go back and talk about kidnapping really quick. There was one more thing I wanted to add. You might hear the term child snatching or parental kidnapping. What this means is that the child is taken by like the non-custodial parent or not returned to the custodial parent at the right time, but it is a parent or somebody who has, an acting role as a parent in that child's life. You see these in times of like retaliation, whether it's divorce, meant to bargain or put fear into that person. There was a case not too long ago that was local. I think it was around the time I was a senior in high school, where the father was very upset, and the mother, he didn't want the children to be returned to their mother. He didn't feel like they were taken care of, and he kind of had used them as like a tool, like, I'm going to take your children away from you so that you can't see them. Well, one day he was supposed to return the children at like 5 o'clock on a Sunday, and don't quote me on those details, but essentially he did not show up with the children. He was arrested for parental kidnapping. They could not find where the children were at. There were so many speculations about like, oh, he's taken them and they're somewhere safe. They're with family friends outside of the state or the country or what have you. And he was saying, yeah, I didn't want them to be returned to their mother. What really happened was he actually took them and he killed them. They were 5 and 6 or 7 or 8. They were very young. He had killed them and he had buried them not too far from here, outside of town in a field, and they were found. So at the beginning, it was a parental kidnapping situation. He had taken them and he wasn't releasing where they were at. However, it obviously turned out to be much more serious than that. The last thing I want to talk about is Domestic Violence and Violence Against Women Act. All states have different and special statutes that deal with assaults and batteries against family members, which we would, refer to as domestic violence or domestics for shortened terms. But domestic violence is, physical abuse by women, most typically against or by their husbands or ex-husbands, again, most typically. We know that it often goes unreported. Many women don't report it. If they do report it, they end up taking it back and saying no, whether it was my fault or they don't want charges filed against their husband. And we know that cycle just continues over and over and over again. Until, unfortunately, for many people, they're seriously hurt, meaning the women may be put into the hospital before something drastic happens, or and far too many cases, the woman is actually ended up murdered by her husband or ex-husband. And again, there was a case not too long ago where that happened around here, and I believe she was killed. And then he lit the house on fire to try and cover up the crime, but it was essentially a domestic at heart. They had gotten into a confrontation and he shot her and killed her, and then he tried to burn down the house and was not successful in hiding the evidence or the body. Lastly, elder abuse. Elder abuse are cases in which the elderly, whether it's by their children or maybe more typically in a nursing home or a long-term care facility, where they are abused, whether it be, sometimes it's sexual abuse, sometimes it's physical abuse, but it's just, again, violence against a victim that's not able to fight back or isn't fighting back. So that's all I have for chapter 10. If you've made it to the end of this, great job. I want you to look up a couple things. If you could look up Lorena Bobbitt and see what happened from her case. And again, if you could look up Matt Shepard, both of those things would be really important, and we can talk about them in our live sessions. Thank you.